Hello once again, math friends. Today we're taking a look at lesson 3.1, and I wanted to start things off with a brief introduction for you before we get into the vocabulary and some of the examples. In lesson 3.1, we're going to take a look at a situation where parallel lines are intersected by what's called a transversal. So I've got two parallel lines here in orange, right? And parallel lines by definition are two lines that are always equal distance apart and they will never intersect. And these two particular lines are intersected by a third line known as a transversal. And a transversal is simply a line that intersects with a series of other lines. Now, when you have two parallel lines intersected by a transversal, there's kind of some cool things that happen here. So what happens is we create 8 different angles. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly number here. So I've got 4 angles here, and then I've got 4 more angles here. So I've numbered all of my angles 1 through 8. And what's kind of cool about this situation, when you have two parallel lines intersected by a transversal, is if I tell you the value of one of these angle measurements, you will be able to determine the values of the other 7 angles. For example, if I tell you that this angle measurement here is, let's say, 100 degrees, you should be able to figure out the measurement of angle 2. Because angle 2 over here, these two angles together, because they form this straight blue line, right? Any two angles that form a straight line, I'm going to actually make another one off to the side here, that's 180 degrees. When I go from here to here, if I measured with a protractor, that would be 180 degrees. So the way I figure out the measurement of angle 2 is I take 180 and I subtract the 100 degrees of angle 1. That means this angle here has to be 80 degrees. So if I know angle 1 is 100 degrees, I can figure out angle 2 is 80 degrees. And I can actually keep going around this little circle here, because now if I look at this orange line, so I've got this orange line here, right? This makes a straight line. So angles 2 and 3 also have to add up to 180 degrees. So if the blue angle is 80, that means this orange angle here also has to be 100. And then similarly, if I look at this kind of angle 4, this is also going to be 80 degrees, because these two angles, 80 plus 100, right, this whole chunk right here has to also add up to 180. So if I know one angle measurement, I can figure all of the others kind of making my way around that little circle there. Okay? So we've got lots and lots and lots of vocabulary that we're going to take a look at and record here in just a minute. But I wanted to kind of show you some of these things before we get into the vocabulary. So one vocabulary term is supplementary angles. Supplementary angles are two angles that have a sum of 180 degrees. So basically two angles that make that straight line. So if we take a look here, angle 1, which is 100 degrees, okay, and angle 2 over here, which is the 80-degree angle, those two are supplementary angles. There's another vocabulary term that we'll use. That's the term adjacent. Adjacent means next to. So any of these two angles or sets of angles that are supplementary, they are also adjacent. Now that term adjacent has nothing to do with how many degrees they are or what they add up to. It just means two things that are next to each other. In addition to the term supplementary, we also have what's called vertical angles. Vertical angles are angles that are like diagonal from one another. So if I look at angles 1 and 3, these two angles are vertical to each other. They're like diagonally across from each other. And so those are what's known as vertical angles. And vertical angles are congruent. Okay? We're also going to talk about corresponding angles, but I'll come back to that here in a second, because I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information right out of the gate here. So there's a lot of vocabulary, but I wanted you to kind of have a picture or an image you could refer to when I talk about that vocabulary here in just a minute. So I'm in our textbook here on page 104 if you wanted to follow along, lesson 3.1. And so it starts by reviewing the difference between parallel lines and perpendicular lines. So if we read along here, right, it says lines in the same plane that do not intersect are called parallel lines. Lines that intersect at right angles, remember a right angle is 90 degrees, are called perpendicular lines. So they're showing us here in this example here, lines L and M are perpendicular to one another. A line that intersects two or more lines is called a transversal. There's that new vocabulary term that we threw at you here just a minute ago. When parallel lines are cut by a transversal, several pairs of congruent angles are formed. So there are lots of different angles that are going to be the same as one another. Okay, so this is the next vocabulary term I haven't quite shared with you yet, something called corresponding angles. So when a transversal intersects parallel lines, corresponding angles are congruent. If you look at this study tip, this is really kind of, I think, a better definition here. Corresponding angles are angles that lie on the same side of the transversal in corresponding positions. So I'm going to kind of trace over here the transversal that matches our textbook, right? So this orange line is the transversal. That's the line that intersects the other two lines. Notice how they've kind of color coordinated various pairs of angles. So here in blue, right, they've kind of marked with these two lines here. They're saying this angle corresponds with this angle. Those two angles are corresponding to one another. And I want to show you, if I trace one of those angles, so let me trace this angle here. And now I'm going to actually click and drag that angle down here. You'll notice it's the same angle, just in a different spot, different position. Okay? So they're corresponding to one another. So they're on the same side of this orange transversal line in corresponding positions. Okay? Similarly, if I get rid of that, and some of my other markings here a second. Oops, I had a feeling that was going to happen. If we take a look at the ones they've marked in green. Okay, so if I look at this angle that's marked in green, maybe it'll let me throw that away. I can't get rid of it. Okay, so if I look at this angle marked in green, corresponds with this angle marked in green. So again, I'm going to trace that for you. So this angle here corresponds with this angle here. Those two angles are corresponding with one another. And corresponding angles are congruent to each other. And I've kind of shown that by taking one and dragging it on top of the other. So if I go back to that very first image, and I'm going to kind of just to undo some of the mess we've got going on here, because there's a lot of things I wrote on the screen. So if I know that these angle measurements are 100 or 80 degrees, angles 5, 6, 7, and 8 are also going to be 100 or 80 degrees. Because angle 1 is corresponding with angle 5, right? So angle 1 and angle 5 are corresponding angles. So angle 5, without even measuring, I know is also going to be 100 degrees. How do I know that? Because they are corresponding angles. And I know corresponding angles are congruent to one another. So again, if I trace over that angle and I drag that over here, it kind of shows, look, it's the same. It's just in a different location. So they're both on the same side of the transversal, right? They're both on the same side of that blue line in corresponding positions. So I could similarly make my way around this figure and kind of do the same thing, because I can say that angle 2 corresponds with angle 6 over here. So I know angle 6 has to be 80 degrees. And I could say angle 3 corresponds with angle 7. So those two angles are 100 degrees. And angle 4 corresponds with angle 8. So that angle is 80 degrees. So that kind of takes us back to that original point that I had made, is if you know one angle measurement, you actually also know the other 7. So if we continue to make our way through some of these examples and activities, what you're going to be asked to do is questions like this. So this is example 1 from your textbook. Again, if you're looking in your book, this is on page 104. It says, use the figure to find the measures of A, angle 1, and part B, this is question B, angle 2. So can we look at this figure and identify those two angle measurements? So I know angle 1 is going to be 110 degrees. How do I know that? Because it corresponds with this angle that they gave me, right? These two angles, they're on the same side of the transversal in similar or corresponding positions. So I know they both are going to have the same angle measurement. So if I know one angle is 110 degrees, I know the other angle is also 110. So I know angle 1 is 110 degrees. They've also asked me to identify what is the measurement of angle 2, right? And this is just the symbol here for angle. That's what that is. It kind of looks like a less than sign, but that's angle. So angle 2, how do I figure out this angle here? Well, remember, these two angles are what we call supplementary. Supplementary angles are angles that have a sum of 180 degrees. So I know that this angle 1 and this angle 2 together, because they form a straight line, have to make 180 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 180 and I'm going to subtract angle 1, which is 110 degrees, which means angle 2 has to be 70 degrees. Okay? So before we get any further, because we've got some other vocabulary to take a look at, I want to look at some of the vocabulary notes. I've used a lot of these words already. So I think for the sake of our video, I'm just going to let you kind of pause on each of these as you need to. So you may need to press pause on the video at some time if you need to convert these over to your Chapter 3 vocabulary notes. But adjacent angles, remember, are angles that are next to one another. Okay? They may or may not be congruent. So adjacent just means next to, has nothing to do with whether or not they are congruent to each other. Vertical angles are the angles that are diagonal from one another in this situation. They are congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of recreate two parallel lines intersected by a transversal. And we'll talk about, I'm just going to mark a pair of vertical angles. So these angles are vertical to each other. This angle here and this angle here. That's an example of vertical angles. They're like diagonally across from each other. These two angles are also vertical. And vertical angles are congruent. I can also look at, let's do this maybe we'll use gray. So this angle here is vertical to this angle here. And those two angles are congruent. Okay? The word complementary is similar to supplementary. It's a similar sort of concept. Complementary angles have a sum of 90 degrees. We're actually not really going to use that in Chapter 3 at all, but I felt like it was important to include that because it's similar to that word supplementary. So complementary angles have a sum of 90 degrees. Supplementary angles have a sum of 180. So again, when we talk about supplementary angles, the angles that form a straight line. So I'm sketching an image for you here of two angles that have a sum of 180 degrees. So if we take a look at this angle here plus this angle over here, those two angles together will add up to 180. All right, parallel lines. Lines that are, we got a typo here, always the same distance apart and never touch. Okay, we shared an example of that earlier in today's presentation, right? These two lines are parallel to one another. Perpendicular lines are lines that meet at a 90-degree angle. Okay, and I would say it's probably a good idea for you to include some of these sketches if you have room in your vocabulary notes as we go. So they've got to meet at a 90-degree angle. That's the symbol for a 90-degree angle. A transversal, remember, is a line that intersects two or more lines. So as we did earlier, right, if I sketch two parallel lines, I'm going to intersect them and actually make these a little bit narrower so they don't take up as much room. And now we're going to create a transversal. So transversal is this third purple line that's intersecting the other two lines. That is a transversal. All right, we talked about corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are angles that lie on the same side of the transversal in corresponding positions. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this image down here a minute so we can reuse this. Right? And I just want to take a minute to mark corresponding angles. So they're on the same side. They're on the same side of the transversal. So like here and here. Right? They're both above that purple line, the transversal, but in corresponding positions. Okay? And corresponding angles, they lie on the same side of the transversal in corresponding positions, but we should also add this information. They are congruent. So corresponding angles are congruent. All right, so now we've got a couple new terms here we haven't talked about yet today. Alternate interior and alternate exterior angles. So I mentioned just a minute ago, and I'm actually going to rewind to, or maybe we'll kind of skip ahead. Why don't we come back to these vocabulary terms here in a second. Let's take a look at this image here. Right, it says, use the figure to find the measures of the numbered angles. Explain your reasoning. So we've got to be able to say like how we know or like why we know something. That's really what's more critical to me. Quite honestly, you'll get very good at this, and I think it'll be super easy for you to fill in like one of these blanks here. A lot of students every year get really good at telling me all these angle measurements. What I think is more valuable is having an understanding of the vocabulary and being able to tell me how you know or why you know the measurement of angle 1. So if I take a look at this picture here, right, if I know this angle is 59 degrees, well, I know lots of other angles here. I can say, well, I know angle 2 is also 59 degrees. How do I know angle 2 is 59 degrees? What would be my explanation, right? I would say, I know, let me make this green so it matches my other writing. I know angle 2 is 59 degrees because it is, I'm going to pause and let you think, what would be the vocabulary term, right? It is, what do I want to use? How does it relate to the given angle, the angle they gave us? It is vertical to, I'm going to say, to the given angle. That means like the angle they gave me. And I guess you could say those words too. It's vertical to the angle they gave me. It's vertical to the 59-degree angle. There's not just like one perfect way to say this, but the key is having an understanding of that term, vertical. I know that angle 2 is 59 degrees because it is vertical to the given angle. And I could write similar explanations for some of these other angle measurements as well. Okay, so let me use, okay, so in purple, let's take a look at, well, I also know angle 5. I know angle 5 is 59 degrees. How do I know angle 5 is 59 degrees? Because it corresponds with the given angle, right? So angle 5, I'm going to kind of copy and paste this. Make it purple so it matches up here, right? So this is me, and now I'm talking about angle 5. So angle 5, I know angle 5 is 59 degrees because it is corresponding to the given angle. So I know they are corresponding angles to one another. So the key really is that explanation, right? Can you explain your reasoning? So how do I know? Now let's look at angle. So angle 7, I also know, is going to be 59 degrees. It's almost like they alternate on alternating sides of the transversal like this. That word alternate is going to come up here again in a second. I know this angle here is also 59 degrees. Okay? But I still have angles 1, 3, 4, and 6. And those angle measurements I can determine with a little bit of mathematical calculation here. I know angle 1 is supplementary to the given angle, right? These two angles are going to make 180 degrees. So I can find angle 1 by taking 180 and subtracting 59. Okay, 180 minus 59 would be, what is that, 121, right? So this is 121 degrees. Okay, I had to take a minute to pause and check my mental work there, right? But I know 180 minus 60 would be 120. Okay, so it's got to be 121 degrees. So again, if I had to give an explanation for that, right, I would say, I know angle 1 is 121 degrees because it is supplementary to the given angle. Okay, so there's two more vocabulary terms we haven't talked about. Right, so let me go ahead and mark in. So all of these other angles are going to be 121 degrees. Oops, sorry about that. So angle 3 is 121. Angle 6 is 121. How do I know? Because angle 3 is vertical to angle 1. Angles 3 and 6 are corresponding. Angle 4 corresponds to angle 1. So that's also 121 degrees. So the last vocabulary term we haven't talked about yet are alternate interior and alternate exterior angles. So let's first take a look at alternate interior. These are angles inside the parallel lines, but on opposite sides of the transversal. So if I drag this down so I can kind of reuse this image, right? So I've got my two parallel lines intersected by the transversal. Alternate interior angles, these are the angles on the interior or the inside of the parallel lines, but on alternate sides of the transversal. So like this angle and this angle here, those are alternate interior angles. We could also use, let's use this lovely shade of brown. So this angle here would be an alternate interior angle to this angle there. So those angles, right, they are congruent. Alternate interior angles are congruent to one another. So that is also important to make note of that. So alternate interior angles are congruent to one another. If I come back to this, and I know this is kind of a mess here, right, but if I'm just going to kind of highlight my alternate interior angles. A second. So this angle here, angle 2, is an alternate interior angle to angle 5. Notice they were both 59 degrees. Similarly, angle 4 and angle 3 are alternate interior angles. So I also could use that really as part of my explanation. Similarly, I can look back here and take a look at alternate exterior angles. So these, a similar idea, they're on opposite sides of the transversal, but they're on the outside of the parallel lines. So I'm going to take a minute here to mark alternate exterior angles. So these are on alternating sides of the transversal on the exterior, right? So it's outside my two parallel lines. So those are alternate exterior angles. And alternate exterior angles are always going to be congruent to one another. We really should add that information. they are congruent. That's a really, really important piece of information. So anytime I give you, okay, I'm just going to kind of skip ahead so we can have a new image. So this information is in your textbook. If you wanted to do some reading about alternate interior and alternate exterior angles, you can find that on page 106. And this kind of shows you an image to try to help you understand alternate interior, right? They're on alternating sides of the transversal inside, or the interior of the parallel lines, versus alternate exterior angles are on the outside of the parallel lines, but still on opposite sides of the transversal. So if we look at this here, it says the photo shows a portion of an airport. Describe the relationship between each pair of angles. So angle 3 and angle 6, and I'm going to take a minute again just to highlight those, right? Angle 3 and angle 6, those are an example of alternate exterior angles, right? 3 and 6 are alternate exterior angles. Now if we take a look at 2 and 7, so 2, right, they're on the inside of the parallel lines, but still on alternating sides of the transversal. Let me make my colors kind of match my work here. All right, and so then we would also have alternate interior angles. So the green angles are alternate interior angles. That's the relationship there. So those are all of the angle measurements, and I could actually go back to one of these questions, right, where I had to like tell, you know, how I know angles, right, explain my reasoning. So I could actually look at this right out of the gate and say, I know angle 6 is going to be 57 degrees, right? Angle 6 is 57 degrees because it is an alternate interior angle with the given angle. So those are alternate, exterior, right? I'm outside those parallel lines, an alternate exterior angle to the given angle. So there's a lot of that key vocabulary. I'm going to kind of leave you with this, right? There's all kinds of angles. These are the ones that are going to be most important. You need to know corresponding angles. They are congruent. Vertical angles, they are congruent. We learned that word adjacent. It just means next to. They're not necessarily congruent. Complementary, you're not really going to use, but it means two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary have a sum of 180. They make a straight line. Alternate interior angles are angles that are on alternate sides of the transversal on the interior of two parallel lines, and alternate exterior angles are the ones we were just talking about a second ago. They're on alternating sides of the transversal on the outside or the exterior of the parallel lines. So that wraps up all of the vocabulary and all the information in lesson 3.1. Have a great day.